Thanks. We are recording it. If you don't want to be seen, I guess you're not, even if you wanted to be seen, you couldn't be seen because we're in webinar mode tonight. We experienced a number of little technical difficulties because we were right until the last minute, we were trying to pull off this program in both Spanish and English. We faced many obstacles, but we're going to continue, and we did not succeed. But we are going to continue trying. So we're sorry you're in webinar mode. We don't like having you in the dark, but we will try to change that for the future. So I'm Pat Gazemba, co-chair of SAFE, along with Cindy Keegan, co-chair of SAFE, and Cindy and David Rowan of the SAFE board are handling the logistics for tonight, and we thank them. Tonight's featured speakers are Dr. Marcos Luna of Salem State University and of Salem State University, and Dominic Nicholas, a researcher and a director at HEAP, and he's also a member of the Gas Leaks Allies, which is where I first got to meet Dominic. Both Dominic and Marcos are unbelievably generous men, talented men, very compassionate men. They have devoted endless hours to working on the issue of gas leaks in Salem and doing something about them. So SAFE and the city of Salem are very grateful to both you, Dominic and Marcos, for all of the work that you have done pro bono for us in Salem, and we certainly appreciate it. We are a city, an environmental justice city, a gateway city, so we face a lot of challenges, and we rely on the generosity and skill of folks like you to make things real for us and to give us the data that we can use to go to folks and tell them, look, something's really problematic and we've got the proof of what's problematic. So I want to say that SAFE believes that this presentation should be happening in Spanish and English, but it is not, because we underestimated the degree of skill that it takes to pull off those kinds of meetings, and we underestimated the amount of money that it costs to actually do something like that as well. So later on in the program, we are going to ask you if you have it in your heart and you have the capability of donating to SAFE. We'll pop up the donation logo, and we'll encourage you to perhaps go to the SAFE website, salemsafe.org, and donate to promote language justice. We are going to remain in this fight of getting language justice for everybody in Salem, so that as we move forward with more work on gas leaks and we move forward on offshore wind, we are going to be doing it with all of our community, not just with those who can speak English and understand it. So thank you for bearing with us, and thank you for coming tonight. After tonight's meeting, we are going to work on getting this presentation into Spanish so that we can put it up on the Salem Safe YouTube channel. And so we'll notify you about that when we have succeeded with that. So I want to turn now to our special guest tonight, Lucy Cachado. She's the president of the Point Neighborhood Association, and she's been an ally of SAFE for years, and she leads her neighborhood association in learning about the problems of gas leaks in their homes and in their streets. And welcome, Lucy. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Pat, for your kind and generous words, and for your invitation. I'm honored to be here, especially among such distinguished panelists. It's very humbling for me. So thank you so much.
You're welcome, Lucy, and we think you certainly deserve to be here. I want to say that back in 2017, when Bob Ackley of Gas Safety Inc. and Nathan Phillips of Boston University turned over to Marcos Luna the data that they had gathered in the city of Salem about gas leaks. Marcos came to the forefront and he plotted the data on the streets of Salem. And back in August, it was actually, I remember it, it was August 27th, 2018, Marcos and I came to a Point Neighborhood Association, and Marcos shared the data about gas leaks to the Point Neighborhood Association meeting. And at that meeting, we were also stymied by language interpretation, and Lucy did much of the interpretation that night for Point Neighborhood Association members who were in the room, who really cared about gas leaks, who had lots of information to share about gas leaks, but who were not fluent in English. So we faced that challenge back in 2018, and we're still facing it, and we're determined now that we're going to do something about it. But what's important about that date, August 27th, 2018, is that just 3 weeks later, on September 13th, 2018, a horrific series of gas explosions struck the Merrimack Valley, the towns of Lawrence, Andover, and North Andover. And it's no surprise to anyone that Lawrence, the EJ city in that cluster of three cities in Merrimack Valley, was the city that was most affected by that explosion. In fact, that explosion caused the death of one young man, and it left up to 8,000 folks in Lawrence out of their homes for some time, some of them for up to a year. And it had a devastating effect on their community. So our irony that there we were, Marcos and I, talking about gas leaks with the Point Neighborhood Association, and this explosion happens in another largely Dominican community. So for those of you who don't know, the Point Neighborhood Association in Salem is largely made up of Dominican residents, not all, but many Dominican residents. So I want to just talk a little bit with Lucy about what the response was. Lucy, can you share a little bit of a reaction of the Point neighborhood neighbors that you spoke with about what the community what they felt about that explosion in Lawrence?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, first, what a twist of fate of having a meeting to learn a little bit more about potential, ramifications of these undetected gas leaks in the neighborhood. I remember during the presentation, both you and Professor Luna presented mapping of the city and showing the big red dots that represented the Point neighborhood, where unfortunately the largest leaks were detected. And so having heard that, and then just 3 weeks later, hearing the horrific explosion in Lawrence was really eye-opening. So we weren't installing any fear. This was reality, and we wanted to ensure that folks in the neighborhood were prepared to not only know who to call, where to go to report gas leaks, but also continue following up with their, public officials in getting this work done. We have many family members of those who were affected in Lawrence. I remember particularly a family who called me because in the rush to evacuate their homes during the explosion, an elderly woman tripped and fell in her front steps of her home and was, severely injured, was bedridden for a number of months, and unfortunately passed a few months later. So, not directly but indirectly from what happened with the explosions. And of course, we know about the poor family who lost their son during that explosion as well. We also had, I work at Salem State, so I had former students who also lived in Lawrence and who were displaced. We also connected with, at the time we had a Salem connection to an aide to Representative Juana Matias, and in asking how we could help the families and folks affected with either monetary or clothing or food, whatever we could do to try to help those who were displaced. We wanted to ensure that, we got the information to be able to start that work here in the neighborhood. But I would say that the biggest impact of your presentation was definitely getting that information to the residents, because we did see and hear, stories about the smell of gas, particularly on Peabody Street, which is, a popular cut through. And at the time I was living on Peabody Street, I remember myself calling a few times to report really strong smells of gas. National Grid would come out, the fire department would come out, you'd see them working for a little bit, and then they would leave and we wouldn't know what the status was. Thanks to your information, that explains some of the trees that weren't thriving on the street either. Newly planted trees who just, I didn't realize that sometimes is a way to detect where there are gas leaks as well. So, thanks to that presentation, it definitely raised awareness to the residents in knowing, how to detect and where to report, and continuing that monitoring of, activity. Thanks to that, also met with Bob Mackey, who came out with the machines to detect the gas. And there were families who signed up to have, their homes tested, particularly those with gas stoves. And, I think thankfully they were low, but I think there were a couple of homes that were a little bit above average. So, that was very helpful as well. So, it was thanks to that information and everything that we saw following the explosions in Lawrence that really got people to realize that this is a reality. Very similar makeup in the neighborhood, a lot of low income, non-English speaking residents who needed this information and continue to ask for help because the work has definitely not been completed. And so that's something that we need to continue working on.
Thanks, Lucy. You gave us a snapshot of what's happening in what happened in your neighborhood and what continued to happen afterwards. So we want to make sure always that we're bringing the voices of the people who are affected into the conversation. The data that Marcos and Dominic gather together and illustrate for us. The data is there, but illustrating it for us in a way that we can understand it and then take action really is important. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Lucy, for being a voice for many people who didn't have an opportunity to voice concerns. Okay.
No, thank you for reaching out, Pat. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It's part of the social commitment that we all have to make a community. I think we're not in this by ourselves. We're all in this together. And so we appreciate your cooperation and your insights as well. So now let's hear from Marcos and Dominic, and they're thrilling to me, but that's maybe because I'm a gas leaks nerd, but their article, An Environmental Justice Analysis of Distribution Level Natural Gas Leaks in Massachusetts, USA, It really excited me when I read it, and I'm hoping that we can hear more about what they're up to now, and what kind of response they've gotten to this article. But let's continue hearing from them. And in part, it's a consolation to those of us who live in EJ communities like Salem, because what their data has shown us is that we're not the only environmental justice city that is suffering from a prevalence of gas leaks. That in fact, in environmental justice cities all across Massachusetts, this is what is happening. And I think that those of us who care about justice, those of us who are outraged after George Floyd, those of us who have cared about justice for years, realize that this is a new frontier, and that as we move into the clean energy revolution, we need to move away from fossil fuels like gas. We moved away from coal in Massachusetts. We're still using a lot of oil. And now I think it's time for us to move to new models of heating and cooking, and models that are not dangerous. So let me turn it over to Marcos and Dominic. And I don't know which of you is going to go first, but I'm sure you'll handle that.
Thanks, Pat. And thanks, Lucy, too. I'll start, and Dom will interject or take over if I start wandering off in the wrong direction. But when we get to it, so I just want to preface this too by saying that I'll start by summarizing the research. If you haven't read this, it's not exactly, maybe for the energy nerds, it's riveting. For others, it might be a little bit of a slog, but summarizing the research. And I'll say, though, that the data that we're talking about gas leaks that we looked at is not necessarily the same data that we presented to the Point neighborhood, and we talked with folks at Salem about, which was data that was collected on the ground by researchers, and kind of showed a slightly different pattern than what we would get from the data that's officially reported to the utilities, or reported by the utilities, I should say, which is kind of a point of conversation. So, but I'll leave that, we'll come back to that, and I'll let Dom take over at that point too, to talk about how to understand that relationship between what we get on the street versus what we're taking from the official state records. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'll show you a little presentation. So I'll put the link to the article in the chat shortly. So it's open access, anybody can read it, but this is a summary of research that Dom and I worked on over the last, it's been more than a year, right, Tom? I think.
Yeah. And most of the last year we worked on it. Right.
So what we were looking at was the gas leaks that were reported by utilities and that are reported to the state. HEAT had been mapping this data since 2015. And so he had already been doing this work. And it was actually on the instigation of Pat Gazemba's suggestion about how does this play out for environmental justice communities that I'd begun to look at it, think about it. And I approached Dom to ask him questions, because he was the guy behind the data that HEAT was putting out. And so we looked into understanding, are the distribution of gas leaks across the state random, or do they tend to occur in certain communities more than others? In my experience working with environmental justice research, looking at how environmental problems play out differently for different communities, particularly poor, minority, or marginalized communities, will say, with a lot of other kinds of burdens, you tend to see this disproportionality, right? Burdens tend to cluster in certain neighborhoods for a variety of reasons. And I kind of figured it might be the case, but we didn't know. So we looked at that data, and we mapped it out, and we compared it to the demographics of the state using census data. And so I'll just jump to the point here. What we found was that looking at 2019 data, this is pre-COVID, we didn't want to use data during the COVID outbreak initially because we weren't sure how it affected the accuracy of reporting. We found that people of color, which includes Indigenous, Black, Hispanic, folks, people who are not white, essentially, limited English-speaking households, lower income households across the state were more likely to live near gas leaks than the general population. And we found this at a variety of scales and across the state. And we also looked at the time it took to repair those leaks, and we found those leaks took longer to repair in those same communities. And the ones that were hadn't been repaired yet were also older, had been there for a long time on an unrepaired status. So what we did is just to, again, we mapped out data that will, I should say, HEAT had been collecting this data from the state, reporting to the Department of Public Utilities. And we took that data and we mapped it out and we looked at it in relationship to the census data that's available at the state level. And that census data can come in at various scales. They can go down to the level of a neighborhood block, essentially, or they can be aggregated up to the whole state, of course. And so we looked at it at different scales in order to see if, if it affects the outcome of what you might see. Because whenever you look for inequalities, people get real suspicious about the findings. And so you have to be doubly careful about communicating that you were rigorous about it. And so that's kind of the reason you go through all this trouble to just see, are we in fact seeing a pattern of some sort? So we looked at where the leaks occurred. We looked at how the leaks were happening next to which kinds of communities in terms of who was living there. And we looked to see whether there were more or less for certain people than others. This is essentially the point of it. And again, we looked at how long it took to repair the leaks that were repaired. And we also looked at the age of the leaks that were still unrepaired at the end of 2019. So here's a map showing just a total leak count for the year 2019. So in 2019, there were 26,000 some leaks across the state. And here they are kind of down to the level of these little hexagons to show you the density of them. So you can see, not surprisingly, that the immediate Boston region has a high density of leaks, but you can also see Worcester and Springfield and Lawrence, Fall River, New Bedford area too, but they're kind of spread out also. So the leaks are pretty much ubiquitous across the state, although there definitely are geographic clusters to them. When I said we wanted to look at it at different scales, we were trying to see, again, is there an inequality in exposure in terms of who lives next to these things more commonly than others? We looked at it at the town level, which is what that map in the upper left shows. You can see all the 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts and colored in terms of the leak density. The darker the color, the more leaks there are per square kilometer in that community. And then in the middle map shows what that looks like at the census tract level. A tract is an area of a community that is designated by the US Census for counting purposes. And then the lower map in the lower right is at the block group level, which is another census unit that gets used, which is even smaller. The graphic in the lower left kind of shows you a comparison of what that looks like at different scales. So in the first graphic you see, that's Chelsea, Massachusetts. It's highlighted in purple. And then in the middle image there, you see, zooming in on Chelsea, you see that orange area is what a tract area looks like. And then on the rightmost graphic, you see the tract in kind of light orange, and then a block group within the tract. So they show you how small of an area we're kind of mapping down to. So we're basically saying how many leaks happen in that area and who lives in that area, how many people are, how many people in total, how many are white, how many are black, how many are Hispanic, and so on, to understand, how people are exposed and what it looks like when you measure it differently. So again, what we found is when we did this analysis, race, ethnicity, essentially Hispanic or not Hispanic, English language ability, and wealth are the leading indicators of gas leaks. So if you know these things, you're more likely to encounter gas leaks in your neighborhood. You get higher proportions of people of color, you're going to have more gas leaks on average across the state. We found that, again, people of color, blacks and Asians in particular, limited English-speaking households were the most exposed. I mean, the more likely to live near gas leaks, and particularly more hazardous gas leaks, which we can talk about later in terms of what that means. And they also had longer repair times, and they were around older leaks that were unrepaired and there for a longer period of time. The way that we measured this and the way that we communicated this is in a way of what we call a ratio or relative exposure. So this is a complicated graph, I realize. If you look at the upper left panel, you'll see a list of the various demographic groups that we looked at. So there's a whole bunch of them. And you'll see, for example, the topmost one says MA low income. Anything with MA in the front is essentially a state designated environmental justice category of people. So we have communities in the state that meet certain thresholds of either high proportions of lower income people, high proportions of minorities, or high proportions of limited English speaking households. So we looked at whether they were more or less exposed. And then we also just looked across the board at various demographic indicators like people of color, limited English households, renter occupied households, various kind of ways that, you know, socially we're stratified, right, in terms of our relative privilege, to see if there's differences. The graph shows when you see orange figures, what that shows is that those areas have relative exposures, or they're around leaks more often than the general population. The blue indicators show that those groups are around less often than the general population. And if they're in gray, that means it's kind of the same. So they're not more or less exposed than everybody else. So if we look on that upper left graph again, we'll see that say Massachusetts low income EJ communities, people living in those communities, are more exposed than the general population. Blacks, for example, are the fourth group down on that upper left figure. You can see there's several figures. It just shows you the variation depending on how you measure it. But in general, they're about 1.5 times more exposed than the general population to leaks across the state. So what that tells you is that this is how many more times these groups are more exposed or have leaks in their communities compared to the general population. And by contrast, white residents of Massachusetts are less exposed than the general population. So they tend to have fewer leaks around them compared to the general population. This is for all unrepaired leaks, so the leaks that were still unrepaired at the end of 2019. And then we broke it out by leak class. So leaks are graded from class 1 to 3, 1 being a hazardous leak or one that could potentially explode. And so those have to be addressed very quickly. So usually they're addressed within a day. So there's very few of them that were unrepaired at the time that we measured this data. So, but even when we look at those, we still see that there's a clear differential for the groups who have more of these around them, although it's a small number. Probably what's more relevant from a statistical perspective is that when we look at class 2 leaks, which have to be monitored, but they don't necessarily represent an imminent hazard in the sense of an explosion or safety hazard, or class 3 leaks, which are not an imminent hazard, and there's more leeway in terms of how a gas company can decide when or how to repair them. Those are a lot more of the unrepaired leaks in a given year. But we see that the pattern stays the same, regardless of the class of the leak. We see this differential so that the orange figures show that these groups are much more likely to be exposed. For example, looking at class 2 leaks, limited English speaking households in those EJ communities are more than 3 times more exposed to these class of leaks compared to the general population as of 2019 at least. So that's how we communicated the data in terms of understand, you know, what's happening and who's getting more or less exposed. The vast majority of these leaks are in the National Grid territory, which shouldn't be surprising. This encompasses the greater Boston region. So you can see that this is the dominant source of these leaks. Columbia Gas is second most, although Columbia Gas was dissolved after the Merrimack Valley gas explosions, and so it was absorbed by National Grid, and I believe also Eversource was sold off. So, which is, you know, a whole other interesting story too. The leaks still have to be addressed, of course. When we looked at it by utility territory, thinking, well, maybe it varies across the state, we see that there's not a very big difference actually. But in most utility territories across the state, you still find a relatively similar pattern in terms of who's more or less exposed. In this case, this graph showing unrepaired gas leaks in terms of who had more likely to be around these things. The only one that's sort of an outlier is the Berkshire Gas territory, which is out in far western Massachusetts, which presents its own interesting scenario. When we break that down in the paper, at least, we see that it doesn't fall along racial lines as like the other territories do. It falls more along economic lines, is what you find, that it's more about income, renter status, renter homeowner status. So that's kind of interesting too, to see like how this isn't always necessarily a racial issue maybe, but it definitely falls along those kind of social stratification lines, those lines of marginalization. So it does kind of fit into the same narrative in the sense of, how these things play out. The vast majority of these leaks that are repaired in a given year are going to be class 1 leaks. And the unrepaired leaks are going to be primarily class 3 leaks, which are the ones that are not an imminent hazard, and they're not considered such an immediate issue to be repaired. So what this graph shows is the distribution of the age of the leaks. So the ages are displayed along the bottom, they're in days. So 3,000 days is about 8 years, just to give you a sense of scale here. And the height of the bar shows you how many leaks fall within that age range. So you can see that when you get it out there, you get somewhere in the order of about 250 to 300 leaks are around 3,000 days old at that time period. So you get the spread. But some leaks were, at least according to the records submitted by the utilities, were more than a decade old that they've been there. And there's interesting reasons you might have, well, how is a leak that old? But there's reasons for that, which are interesting to discuss too. When you look at leak age across the state, and this is at the level of block groups, those census units, you can see there's kind of a interesting northwest to southeast axis running across Boston region. We suspect, but don't know for sure because it's not easily accessible data on the pipeline ages that you could like map out and identify, but we suspect this might be reflective of the age of the pipelines that kind of run through the region, since that's one of the indicators of a leakiness of a pipe. We see it's one of interesting patterns of where those the age of unrepaired leaks are, or how old they are. When we look at the ages of these unrepaired leaks, the leaks that were still unrepaired at the end of 2019, we see that there's also a similar pattern of disproportionate exposure to old leaks that were left unrepaired. Where it's most prominent, I think, though, when we look at this, is in the class 3 leaks. Like I said earlier, class 1 leaks need to be repaired right away. And there's very few of them that were unrepaired in 2019, as you would expect. So there's not a lot going on there, and there shouldn't be. When we look at class 3 leaks, it's a more interesting pattern because this is where there's more, as far as we understand it, more discretion in how these get addressed. And there might be more factors at play here too, but nevertheless, what we see is that, again, the low-income, minority, limited speaking households, these communities are the ones that see leaks that have been there longer, that haven't been repaired for much longer periods of time. This is where you find them. So when we conclude this analysis, at least up to this point, this is again only looking through 2019, we make recommendations. And these recommendations are at the state level, and they're also at the federal level that we're aiming them. We definitely want to advocate for regular evaluation of utility performance, and we advocate that prioritization of leak repair and assessment of leak priorities take into account equity, that they take into account vulnerable communities. So that should be part of the calculus of how you say, where do we fix these things, or how do we think about going forward on these. Detailed public reporting, which Massachusetts is a leader on, is something that needs to continue, and it should be modeled by the rest of the country. You can't do this analysis in other parts of the country yet because nobody else is reporting data like Massachusetts is. So this is only possible to do this kinds of analysis because the state has a law requiring the utilities to report to the Department of Public Utilities the leaks. And then you have an organization like HEAT actually doing the work of mapping it. So far, this is still, nonprofit work that's generating this information for public dissemination. Otherwise, it's very hard to come across, this data. As we're putting this out, we're also anticipating, or we're advocating for actively, a move to clean energy future. And one of the things that is thankfully brought up more and more is let's think about how this is going to play out for different groups of people, because like the leaks themselves or any other kind of infrastructure issue or environmental issue, we don't all have the same experience. And so we have to think through what might be the regressive impacts of transitions that we plan that may play out differently for different people. And so we need to incorporate that into our planning. So for example, if as we move off gas, it seems from the literature and the data that the people who are moving off gas first are going to be wealthier households, and that may end up inadvertently, although getting us in the right direction, may end up leaving some communities behind who can't afford to move off gas first. And what does that mean for them in terms of bearing the cost of that, slowly diminishing ratepayer pool to support that system? And then, kind of in harmony with the rest of our arguments, we argue too that environmental justice communities in particular, given what the data shows, should be prioritized, not just in terms of fixing problems, but also in terms of planning for solutions, so that when we start saying, where do we invest for the future, those communities that have long been marginalized or left behind, or left with the worst kinds of infrastructure, that those are the first places you'd start with in terms of trying to address what to do going forward. So
if I could just jump in with just
Yes.
one extra point there, and this has come up before when we've talked about this work, that we didn't investigate the causes of this, these findings. We didn't look into why were there potentially these different exposures, and I think there's definitely an opportunity there for more study. And we haven't looked into what the impact is of these findings on health and safety in communities either. So it's just kind of laying out the kind of the raw material, if you like, for further study. Carry on, sorry.
No, that's a great point. And I think that people were going to ask that too. I'll take ownership of this one. I have a lot of opinions about what are things going on, but that's not part of the analysis. So the analysis says, as Don said, this lays out the raw facts. This is what's going on. Regardless of intention to discriminate or not, this is what's happening. People are having a different experience with these leaks. They're falling in certain neighborhoods more often. Some neighborhoods are getting fixes faster. Some leaks are left longer, and they seem to be falling in certain communities. And it is an open question about why is this happening, and particularly how do you stop it from happening, right? How do you move forward to a solution to make this not the case? Now, Pat asked, and I tried to comply with doing a little bit of a drill down for Salem, and Dom and I were very nervous about doing this for individual communities because it could turn into a very large project, but this is Pat, so it's hard to say no. So looking at Salem, and so I started at the beginning prefacing this, that when we presented about gas leaks in Salem, and previously, at least when I have, in working with Pat and Bob Ackley and Nathan Phillips in particular, we were looking at the data that we collected they collected on the ground, separate from what this utilities report. And there is a discrepancy, there's a difference between what the researchers have collected on the ground versus what the utilities are reporting. And the reported data from utilities is a lot less in terms of the incidence of reported gas leaks compared to what the data on the ground seems to show going through these gas leak detectors through the street. So in the same year that we were analyzing for the state as a whole, just looking at Salem, there were 178 leaks in total that year that were reported by the utility for the city of Salem. And here the map, the red ones are unrepaired at the end of 2019, and then the bluish, dark blue are those that were repaired. So we're about 40% or so were unrepaired at the end of 2019. So you can kind of see how they're distributed across the neighborhoods of Salem. When we look at Salem, we also recognize that, or you may not recognize it, a number of parts of Salem fall into state designated environmental justice communities. So these are communities, as I mentioned earlier, that meet one of three or more criteria, which is high minority population, high proportion of people who are lower income, and then high proportion of people who live in limited English speaking households. And the color codes are indicated by the key in the lower right. And you can see, sort of where the leaks fall relative to those communities. When we did our analysis, state level, what we were doing was taking those block groups, which are smaller than the neighborhoods here that you see in the map, and we were looking at the density of leaks within those sub-communities to see what that looks like. So here's a map of the same area, but by density. So you see the number of leaks per square kilometer in this case. So it's a number of leaks per, so you get a density sense across the city. So you can kind of see a slightly different pattern in terms of where they're concentrated. So you notice the Chestnut Street, Broad Street neighborhoods kind of pop out a little bit. Parts of North Salem, downtown show up in terms of high density. The Point, parts of the Point neighborhood do too. When we took that data, then we looked at who lives in those communities. So we looked at the density relative to the numbers of different kinds of people you would find in those neighborhoods based on the census. And so when we did the same kind of graphs to look at the relative exposure, interestingly, we find that when we look at all leaks as a whole for that year in Salem, at the block group level, we find that, for example, the people who will fall into the low income environmental justice category were more exposed than the general population of Salem in that time period. You see renter occupied housing units. I'm looking at the top left panel here. Hispanic, low income are more exposed than the general population of Salem. And then you look in the lower left, the blue areas, you can see these groups are less exposed than the general population. This is for all leaks, and then they're broken down by leak class. So you can see, so there's some similarity to what we saw with the state as a whole, and there's also some differences, which is not surprising when you drill down to a smaller area to see what's going on in that area. So I think what's interesting here is that the for the most part, as a whole, the leak experience isn't terribly different in Salem than it is in the rest of the state, right? We're still seeing some of those historically marginalized groups who are seeing a disproportionate number of leaks in their communities when we look at Salem specifically. Now, it varies depending on what kind of leaks we're looking at, though. So when we look at unrepaired leaks, just isolating those, interestingly, it's mostly renter-occupied housing units, people who live in renter-occupied housing that are seeing more of the leaks that are unrepaired in 2019. Although it depends again, by the class of the leak. I'd ignore class 1 leak since there was only one that was unrepaired in 2019, so it's not much to work from. But looking at class 2 leaks, there were 13, not a large number, statistically kind of on the margins of what you can say with that, but still kind of a similar pattern of minorities, Hispanic, people of color. But again, we look at class 3 leak and it's the opposite. Class 3 leaks, actually whites are more exposed to those unrepaired leaks, although renters still pop out, which again, when I see a recurring pattern like that, that kind of calls my attention. And again, it's problematic because when we look at these groups, it's hard to know how they intersect. So for example, with class 3 leaks, you see white and then you see renter occupied housing units. I'm looking in the lower right. And we don't know if these people are lower income renting people who are white, or if they're two different groups. We can't tell from the data necessarily. So this would be something that would have to be looked at more closely to know what's going on there. In terms of the age of those unrepaired leaks, when we look at that, again, looking at the upper left, I was going to start with all the leaks. Interestingly, Salem has a relatively small Asian population. It's only about 2% of the city, but they are strikingly more exposed to, the leaks that they're around are considerably older compared to the general population of the rest of the city. And that would be the Asian population, when I looked at Salem, is kind of spread out, but it's mostly in the southern half of the city is what I could see primarily. Repaired gas leaks, not a whole lot of difference, but again, you see, again, some of those same groups kind of at the top of the list in terms of slightly more exposed, but not a terribly large difference in terms of the relative exposure. And then in terms of repair time, we see, again, variation. So for leaks as a whole, Asians stand out again in the city. Interestingly, older folks that are older. And class 1 leaks, which are, again, these are the more concerning ones, but are usually addressed relatively quickly. So the differences in time aren't very large. But again, it's interesting, right? So you see a different pattern than what you would expect. So you're kind of seeing that I'm walking you through some of how the sausage gets made on research. So some of the stuff, it's messy in terms of what you're looking at. And lastly, and I don't mean to walk you through the whole thing, I'm almost done, I swear. The unrepaired leaks, I'll let Dom talk to explain. So the age of unrepaired leaks, the ones who've been sitting out there, again, what stands out to me here is we look at the Asian residents in the city of Salem have older leaks that are unrepaired. They're more likely to be around older leaks that are unrepaired in the city. And that is an interesting pattern that also showed up in the statewide data too. So I think it's one thing to think about. If I was in the city of Salem and I was trying to think about, where are these problems occurring, they're not always obvious in terms of, who's relatively exposed to these things. So that's all I have for right now. I'll stop harassing you with data and graphs. So Dom, I don't know if you want to bring it forward in terms of, this is 2019.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's
2020. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because we did run 2020 data through this machinery too at the state level, and did find pretty much the same pattern. And the 2021 data, I'm literally just finishing up, so we'll push that through the same machinery hopefully this year and see if we still see the same pattern. We'll still have 3 years of data going through the same process and see if there's a consistent pattern. No, I mean, I'm actually just really curious about what people have in terms of questions. I mean, I know it's a lot of information to take in, but I think the general gist of it is pretty clear. Probably, if I was sitting there thinking, well, heck, what can we do about this? Where do we start taking action? I think that's a complicated question, but I'm curious, what do people have in terms of questions about this? And you can put it in the chat, or I don't know if you have the ability to ask with your microphone. I'm not sure how this is working, but it was a Q&A section. Here we go. So I'll just read out one of these questions, if that's okay. I mean, from Bonnie Bain, have our congressional leaders been notified of Massachusetts' unique move of tracking detailed data, and have any federal bills been put forward to require tracking across the US? Seems like something quite a few of our reps would push for. Well, I'll field that one a little bit. We are ahead in terms of reporting and transparency in Massachusetts. Every opportunity I get when I do a study or a paper like this is I push for trying to change federal regulations to require this level of transparency and detailed reporting across all utilities and all the regulators in the country, because then we could really see the scale of this problem nationally. And that, I think, would be a massive pressure point for utilities nationwide. So have any bills like this been put forward nationally? I don't know, not that I know of, but I'm not really a regulator or a legislator. I'm not quite plugged into that. Marcos, do you know if anything is, ideally since our paper was released, regulations are flying off the table? Has anything moved to your knowledge?
No, I think that's one of the things we've been, so when we released the paper and we talked to a number of journalists about this, this is one of the first questions I ask is, well, what about the rest of the country? What do we know about them? And we have to tell them the same thing is, well, they can't do this. I mean, no one's done this because they can't. And it's not because they don't want to. There's a lot of research out there that have tried to do this. I think the legislative activity at the federal level that I've seen around gas leaks has mostly been aimed at the producer level. So where the gas is mined and getting leaks under control at that level. But I'm not aware of anything at a federal level that's aimed at uniformly addressing gas leaks at the distribution level, which is where we were looking at, which is the pipes that run into our homes. And I think it's only relatively recently that people, and I'm talking about researchers as well as regulators, the EPA, but also state level, have come to appreciate that the distribution level is actually significant, that there might actually be a significant amount of methane that's leaking out of these pipes, and that has a significant impact on climate change concerns as well as the cost to people. But yeah, I mean, we would love to see federal action, and this is Dom and I have been looking for opportunities to kind of push that message that this is something that needs to rise to that level. And we are putting this forward in front of a variety of different advocates in Massachusetts who are connected to our legislators too. So we're hoping that this is how we build that base of interest that could take it somewhere too.
Yeah, I'll go on to another question from Ricardo Felix Cavano. Is why the utilities don't fix leaks in a timely manner, and who's paying for the repair work? The first one, I mean, there are regulations in place in Massachusetts that define how quickly they need to repair different grades of leaks. So a grade 1 is required to be repaired in 24 hours, and grade 2s within a year, and grade 3s, depending on whether they're super emitters or not, 1 to 3 years. So it's a great question. I mean, there's this large number, as you saw, of grade 3s, which have been sitting around for a very long time in some cases. And from what I understand, part of the new regulations put in place a couple of years ago say leaks, all these grade 3 leaks need to be fixed within 8 years of, like, I can remember what the date was. It was January 1st, 2018 or something like that. And so from my understanding is the utilities are working through this backlog. And, I've just crunched some of the numbers recently. I mean, when we did this study, we had 26,000 leaks in the big bucket, in total, repaired, non-repaired. I'm seeing that number go down. So this year, I think it was more like 24,000. So I do see a slight downward trend, but I don't have a straight answer, honestly, for why we have leaks that are 10 years old. It's astonishing to me. I think that those, and this is just my opinion, I think those leaks that are chronic should be now changed in category to be more regarded as super emitting leaks, because they've been leaking for so long. But I don't know exactly why they're not being repaired more quickly. And it really bothers me. And I think, it really upsets me this is happening. The costs, as far as I understand, because somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the costs are passed through to the ratepayers to do all of this repair work. There's also the gas system enhancement program, which is a different kind of structure, but I think we'll just stick with the specific leak repairs in this conversation, because we didn't analyze those leaks in this study. Marcus, do you want to add anything to that? I mean, why is not?
Yeah, no, well, this is more Dom's area of expertise than mine, but I think that one thing to keep in mind is the paradigm of how these leaks have been understood up to this point is then in terms of their hazardousness, in terms of the likeliness of explosion. And so the utilities have, by law, focused on things that might explode. And so those have very specific definitions of what that means. It's not necessarily leaks that have they're gushing gas. I mean, obviously that's a risk, but it has more to do with the conditions of the leak that might create a situation where it could explode. And so that's the focus, not necessarily on lost gas or the expenses of lost gas or the inconvenience of smell or the potential of chronic exposure. Those are just not part of the legal landscape, right, for prioritization. And so Dom and I have been talking for quite a while too, also about, and this is a separate conversation, about better understanding how the utilities do prioritize these kinds of things, because that's unclear to us in terms of exactly how do they decide we're going to replace that pipeline versus this pipeline. And that's one of the things that came up in the aftermath of the Merrimack Valley gas explosions was, they had external auditors come look at the gas companies and say, how are you deciding how and when to repair things? And that was a big question. And they had concerns that were raised about how they were prioritizing, but it's still an open question, something worth looking at.
Yeah. How are we doing on time? I don't want to go over. We're at 8 o'clock. Pat, how much time we got?
I think we can go for another 10 minutes.
All right. So there was another question. There's a couple of great questions coming in. I'm just going to try and go over them real quick. There was one from Jill Frieden. We're comparing the Aliso Canyon leak with these leaks. So these leaks that we're studying here, these are leaks that are on a distribution system. So they're on the pipes under the streets on mains, and then some of them are also on pipes from those mains to your building, so on the service lines. They're outside, they're underground typically. And it really brings up a great question, like what is a gas leak? I mean, I think one of the reasons we see a disparity between researchers on the ground, driving vehicles, gathering data, and reported leaks is, there's differences in the way you can survey a leak. And so a surveyor for a gas company might go out to a leak and, survey an area and say, well, there's a gas leak here. We might go out with a finer granularity and find that actually there might be 2 or 3 gas leaks here. And so what is a gas leak? Really, it depends what your definition is. So I'm waffling here. Is there an access to the system that could be an obstacle to repair? I'm not sure what that means. I'm going to keep moving. How do these gas leaks impact people's health? So we don't know exactly yet. This is a new area of research. Heat and Harvard T. Chan School of Medicine, we just released, or we're about to release a new study about the chemistry of gas. But that's opening up a lot of questions like, well, how does this then therefore impact people's health? As far as I know, there aren't, I don't know if there's actually any studies on the effect of ground level pollution from gas leaks on people's health. So those leaks that are outside on street, how does it impact people's health? Gas being majority methane. Don't know. Haven't seen too many studies on that, if any. So I don't know much, and anyone else can jump in. Yeah, that's what I thought. So let's see, just jumping over to the Q&A. I'm trying to rush through this, but yeah, okay. So I'm going to read this one by Anonymous Attendee. It sounds like someone in the utility company subjectively selects or prioritizes the area to repair instead of methodically or systematically going through streets in an area. Is that correct? Well, we don't know exactly. Like Marcos said, there's this thing called the Distribution Integrity Management Program, DIMP, I think it's, if I got that right. And this is at the federal level, do say, they do put down basic guidelines for gas companies to follow. And from what I understand, they take the utilities take those guidelines, but they also then introduce their own prioritization procedures too. So it's a kind of an amalgam of different things. And we don't have full clarity into all of the process and procedure and prioritization methods that they use, at least to the best of my knowledge. Now, that may be buried in a DPU docket somewhere. I know the GSEP programs do actually talk about them in more detail, but so I may have missed it. So, it could be out there, but to my knowledge, it's still a bit of a gray area. And he said, would changing the process to be a more logical or scientific method of street repair selection reduce the social injustice? Well, I mean, it's actually really interesting, because it's one of the things we're recommending here is that utilities should bring into their procedure and prioritization process this framework. I don't know what that framework looks like exactly, but they need to think about it and include that as one of their criteria. So, I mean, Marcus, if you want to jump in on there, because I think that's probably more up your alley.
Sorry, I was trying to respond to a question in the chat at the same time. So which question were you looking at?
Well, we're talking about the you know, how would you, I think actually the question I've got out of this question is, what would you recommend to a utility to include environmental justice framework as a way to think about how to prioritize repairs?
Yeah, well, I think, and that's probably the most difficult part of this whole analysis, that reporters have a hard time wrapping their heads around, and others who haven't thought about equity when it comes to these kinds of subtle environmental burdens. What does that mean? Well, on one level, the whole point of identifying marginalized communities or environmental justice population areas is that these are communities that historically have been left out of conversations that control their infrastructure, their landscape, their risk exposure. And these are the same communities too that have, because of structural inequalities and discrimination over historically as well as today, have less power to protect themselves. So if something goes wrong with infrastructure, whether it's an explosion or just the loss of gas for a few days, that has a bigger disruptive effect on communities that are more marginalized, because they don't have the wherewithal necessarily to handle that as easily as somebody who can just check into a hotel for the week, or who can call up their insurance agent when something goes wrong, or they can rely on their health insurance to take care of them when somebody gets sick, or take a few days off of work if they can't take a shower. There might be minor inconveniences to a middle-class homeowner, but they can be massively disruptive and catastrophically disruptive to people that don't have any kind of safety net underneath them. And so that means then that when you're thinking about the landscape of infrastructure or risk, you take the weakest, most vulnerable population into account first when you start to do your planning, not the average, again, middle-class homeowner, because you're gonna leave a lot of people behind. I mean, we've seen this mistake made in disaster planning for years, going back from Hurricane Katrina all the way to today. And I think those lessons have yet to be embedded in a lot of other things. And I think gas infrastructure, not just because of explosions, but certainly those two, is something where we can say, what does this mean for a vulnerable community when we're planning these things out, thinking through things that can go wrong? So I think that's one way to kind of reframe a conversation about what does it mean to introduce this kind of lens of looking at this problem, is saying, let's start with the most vulnerable communities first when we start planning out these things.
Pat, I don't want to go over time, so wait, you're muted.
Thank you. I'm looking at one question that Kate Enderlin asked, and Marcos may have answered it already, and that was about the Berkshires and the less diverse kind of community out in the Berkshires, but certainly an economically depressed area in many sections of the Berkshires. I think that might be the answer, Kate. Jim Malloy asked the question, are the utilities using the fixing of leaks to build infrastructure? Let me move this over a little, to build infrastructure and that will allow the business to persist for decades. Do you have an answer about that, an opinion about, well, there's maybe an opinion about that one.
Yeah, I've got some opinions. I mean, talking about pipeline replacement, there's a couple of questions in here, Steve Dibble and others. Hey, what about all this pipe that's been replaced? Doesn't seem to be where the leaks are. Well, they're all related, I think. The pipeline replacement program is, or the gas safety enhancement program is a little bit controversial. Its initial intention was sensible. Let's replace the most leak-prone infrastructure, and let's do it efficiently. We'll find where clusters of leaks are, and we'll, instead of replacing each one, we'll replace the whole section of pipe. However, similar questions we have though are, well, how are you prioritizing that? How are you figuring out where to do that? And the big concern with that is that we're spending, the new estimate actually from the Gas Leaks Allies and from Dory, who wrote the GSEP at the 5-year mark report recently, is that this project is expected to now cost over $40 billion, $40 billion into an infrastructure which we're supposed to be moving away from. We're not, our climate goals don't include using fossil fuels and gas. So it really makes you kind of scratch your head. So one of the things I've done a couple of years ago was actually extract and parse and map all of the pipeline replacement plans. And what's tricky with trying to figure out, well, what's going on with that is there's not really a clear report about what's being done. So that's partly where this GSEP report is driving, is like getting more accountability and having more transparency into what's going on there. So it's a bit of a quagmire, and it's kind of a hot topic right now. But yeah, I'm concerned that it does lay the groundwork potentially, and Sarah Griffiths is here. I think potentially lays more groundwork for use of hydrogen as a potential mix and blend. But it's a tricky area. How they prioritize which areas is also, it's actually fairly well documented in the GSEP plan dockets. But again, it kind of falls back under that sort of gray area. Well, here are the recommended guidelines, and you go add your own secret sauce. So I'm not, I just think we're still in this learning phase with pipeline placement. But it to me, it feels kind of controversial to be putting so much money into a system we're supposed to be moving away from. I know it wasn't a straight answer, but I felt like I wanted to share my opinion on this. I think others may have similar opinions too.
Yeah, I want to turn to Lucy, but first I just want to interject one on the ground kind of Salem observation about this. And someone had put this, I believe Elizabeth Churchill put it in the chat, and that is that we did this research. We showed that it was the point area that was the most hard hit by gas leaks. And yet, when it came to putting in replacement piping, those big yellow pipes that are omnipresent in Salem, it was in my neighborhood, which is the Salem Willows neighborhood, which is a middle-class neighborhood. And we had nothing like the kinds of leaks that were found, that the utilities themselves reported in the point areas. So I just want to say that it highlights an equity issue.
Well, it's a big question. And so one thing that I've been working on is getting the data for the pipeline replacement, those yellow pipes you talked about, into the hands of somebody like Marcos. And we just discussed this recently. I don't want to put him on the spot, but I've been urging researchers to use this data, the GSEP plans data, to do an analysis to figure out what is going on in terms of prioritization. So we've been discussing this recently. I don't want to put Marcus on the spot because I think we're still thinking about it, but the data's there now. We have the plan data and we can do research with it, do a geospatial analysis. And Marcus has got some really excellent ideas about testing what they're saying their procedural prioritization is against what they did and what's going on. So that might actually shed some light on why is my neighborhood that doesn't seem to have gas leaks getting GSEP'd when that neighborhood over there isn't. We still are learning, and I think it's easy to make these sweeping remarks, but I think we need to do the research before we really are able to say those kinds of things.
Okay, let's, Lucy, you wanted to comment.
I just wanted to quickly say that knowledge is power, right? Not to sound cliche, but these conversations need to continue so that folks who do get the information then know what to do with it. We have an opportunity in Salem to advocate for, where to spend some of these ARPA funds that Salem has gotten. And, things like infrastructure. I mean, one of the criteria was infrastructure for, cleaner water, drinking water, and improvements. But this is something that I think we could also lobby for, particularly where if we can't even pay, it always comes down to money. Either the utility companies don't want to pay for these upgrades or work, or if we can't even get language, translations because sometimes for lack of funds, some of these funds should go to the work that's necessary to continue, particularly in these marginalized communities. And that's where this American Rescue Plan Act funds were supposed to be benefiting, were these particular communities. We saw how vulnerable they were during COVID, and it highlighted so much, health inequities and education, lack of technology. And so I think this is a time the city is still asking for comments as to where to spend some of this money. And I think this is where we need to continue pushing for.
Pat,
Yeah,
can I
sure,
build on that real
Marcos.
quick? I want to echo Lucy's point too about, bringing in those voices. This is one of my ideas about what causes at least some of these inequities to happen, is that I suspect that a lot of institutions have a squeaky wheel policy, that they essentially address the squeaky wheel, and some of us are better at making the wheel squeak than others. And when that kind of policy is allowed to dominate the allocation of resources or money, then that risks exacerbating inequities or inequalities, because people who know how to work the system, who know how to call people, who have the confidence to reach in and get things moving to get what they need, more power to them. But the problem is that that's how the institution is allowing priorities to get made. It's going to just replicate inequalities and inequities over and over again. So taking an equity focused lens means that you're not letting that happen. We do not need to rediscover that we live in an unequal world, a highly segregated space. Massachusetts is highly segregated. I hope that's not shocking to anybody. And this is not by accident, not because people just want to live next to who they look like. Some of us do, obviously, but what's happening is that this is just part of a pattern of behavior. And so we know that. And so since we know that's a reality, then we need to react to it if we want to address it. And that one of the ways is to proactively look for ways of doing policy that give communities that are otherwise excluded an opportunity, a clear opportunity to be involved, to have a say in the system and the allocation of resources. And I think we know how to do that already. I don't think we have to reinvent that wheel. And so this is, yet again, another instance of something that needs to be addressed. And I think that there's a lot of good solutions on the table already about what we need to do. And there's a lot of good models. And I think, with the gas issue, there's a lot of things happening right now. Pat, you mentioned at the beginning, Gas Leaks Allies is also, all over the place on plans for the future of the utilities. And Dom said, we're supposed to be getting off gas relatively soon to meet our climate goals. And a lot of big decisions are getting made with a lot of money in the background about those decisions. And the question is, not just what are those decisions, but who's at the table when those decisions are made, and how are they going to affect different communities when these things get played out? Where's that money going to go, and who's going to be involved?
It's a good point. A good point for us to pause and move to some action that we might take. And first, I want to thank Dominic and Marcos and Lucy, because it is the information that you are sharing with us that gives us the strength, the knowledge to go ahead and advocate for change. And without you, we don't have those important moneyed interests in the city of Salem who are going to be able to just call the utilities, call Beacon Hill, and get things to change. Thank you for your research, for your advocacy, because I know that both Dom and Marcos and Lucy, well, let me just say Dom and Marcos to start with, are not only scholars, but they're activists, and they're equally engaged with what they can do to help us make things change at the State House that will then put out laws. But laws don't change things overnight. Marcos was an important figure in getting environmental justice right in the last climate roadmap bill. It got passed and signed into law in March of 2021. March of 2022 has just passed us, and an environmental justice council that was called for in the legislation was supposed to be set up right away. And as of yesterday, it was not set up. So that means we get laws passed and we have to keep advocating to get them passed. And I just think it's not easy, but it really needs all of us to be more knowledgeable. So I thank all of you who showed up for the meeting tonight too, because what you have done is made yourself more knowledgeable about what this issue is, so that when we come to you to get you to sign a petition or make a call or push with others, you can go forth and talk about these issues, knowing that you've got research behind you and you've got advocates behind you. So I want to introduce now Jim Malloy, who is a leader with 350 Mass. And he's also on the SAFE Advisory Board, and he is very active with Citizens Climate Lobby. He's a one-man environmental, well, not one man, he is all about building community and getting more of us involved in advocacy. So I want to introduce Jim, who can give us some ideas about what we can do to help push the recognition of some of these issues to the front on Beacon Hill. So Jim, go ahead.
Oh, Pat, thank you so much. You're too generous. We all do our part. So Lucy and Dominic and Marcos, this was amazing. Thank you so much. It's really critical to raise, EJ issues, and a forum like this has done it for me. So Cindy Keegan put together this slide. April, as you know, is Earth Month, and we have Earth Week coming up, and then Earth Day on Friday, the 22nd or 23rd, whatever Friday is Earth Day. So there's a lot going on this month, and a number of things are oriented around EJ issues, and Cindy put them onto this slide here. So April 21st at 6:30, which may be the day before Earth Day, Thursday maybe. There's an Environmental Justice and Offshore Wind Revolution presentation in the WBR City Space. And May 3rd and 5th, we talk again about the future of gas. So a lot of organizations have come together in Massachusetts to respond to the regulators and the utilities and their horrible plan they're putting forth on where gas is in Massachusetts' future. They want it to be for 50 more years. And we are not happy at all at what they have come out with. And they're trying to do it before Baker's term ends. And we're giving a huge pushback on that. So that May 3rd and 5th DPU forum, we need people to be testifying and submitting statements. And then, of course, future of heat and geogrids, the bills that we're pushing, call your legislators. Senator Lovely for Salem, Paul Tucker, we need these bills to be passed. This is the solution to our future. And the PBD-Peaker has also activities going on during Earth Week. And I think Cindy has a slide on that too. Yeah, okay, this one here. If you go to that bit.ly link, you can sign up for the PBD Earth Week, and there are 4 standouts. And this is basically to say, you can't be putting more dirty pollution into these areas so close to EJ communities. We have a different future in our vision. We can use battery storage. The grid says it's too cheap, and that's actually the slide we just skipped, the Fix the Grid. So we got to put in comments to FERC, the federal agency that regulates our grids, basically. ISO New England, who is the utility, grid regulator for New England, they have decided that renewables are too cheap and we have to control their entry into the grid. And so they have a new rule that they're asking FERC to say yes to. And so next week on Thursday, we have a FERC comment party. We're asking people to join us and just, send a letter to FERC and say, And there's a lot of help and it should be fun. They try to make it fun. So I think that's it. Pat or Cindy, please weigh in on what I missed.
I'll just say that I know that we've kind of bombarded you with all of this information, but we will continue to send it out. So if you registered for today's webinar, we will add you to our list and we'll send you details about how you can follow up with each of these. We know that it kind of went by fast, but I think we'll give you the details about how you can go through signing on to petitions, sending in comments, and maybe, hopefully, some of you coming and testifying before the legislature on some of these issues. It's going to be fast and furious now to the end of the legislative session. The Senate just surprised us today. We were all expecting, and I got this news first from Jim Malloy, we were all expecting that the Massachusetts Senate would release its version of the climate bill for this session on Earth Day. That's what they had been telling us. And then lo and behold, they surprised us by releasing their legislation today. They always find ways to keep us off balance. But I haven't even been able to look at the press conference, but I heard that Senator Cream was at the press conference. And I have to say that Senator Cream lit up my life this week talking about gas when she said, when the state has commitments about reducing, I'm not quoting her directly, but when the state has commitments about reducing emissions and the state continues to support gas. In the hearing before the Department of Public Utilities, she said the question is all on the future of gas. And in Senator Cream's opinion, she said the future is a future without gas. That's what we should be looking for. We shouldn't be looking at how we are going to accommodate gas in the future. We should be looking about how we can do without gas. And there are many people in this webinar who know this very well. People working with the Gas Leaks Allies. I give a shout out to Sarah Griffith. They are warning us about the utilities trying to save their economic model by blending hydrogen, which is a highly explosive gas, with natural gas. And they are then when you ask about, or when I made the comment about why these new pipes, the new yellow pipes, are being put in the streets, they are being put there partly because the gas company is counting on pumping a blend of gas, natural gas, and hydrogen through the streets. Very dangerous proposition, but one that will continue to maintain their economic model. So I think that's the real problem. And when we look at the slide that's up on the screen now, you can see that going to electrifying our homes is really the solution. We need to do that, and we need to have that electrification supported by offshore wind, which we hold to have great promise in Salem, and also by expansion of solar. We need more renewable sources of energy to power the heat pumps, the air source heat pumps and the geogrids that heat has been pioneering. We need more renewable resources to power those innovations. And that's what we should be thinking about. And we should also be thinking about Senator Cream. Let that be our mantra. The future of gas, there is no future of gas. Well, we thank you very much. Any of the panelists want to have one last word? Cindy Keegan, is there a message that you want to convey?
I just wanted to note that I did put the links to the items in the chat as well. So if anybody wants to copy those up, they can do that.
Okay, great, great. Well, thank you all for being patient and sticking with us. We know we weren't bringing you all good news, but we were bringing you, I hope, a glimpse of hope, because that's what we all represent, is hope, that we're paying attention to this issue. We're learning how to talk about the issue. We're learning how to write up testimony that will push it. If you want to help us in SAFE to bring more language justice to the city of Salem, to our community, we direct your attention to this little graphic on the left-hand side, 20 for 20. SAFE is celebrating its 20th year. And if you go to our webpage, salemsafe.org, you'll see a donate button at the top, and you'll see board member Bonnie Bain's adorable daughter, Peyton Bain, who is Peyton Massey, who is older than that right now. She's celebrated her first birthday, but she's the future, and the future is all around us. And we hope that you can help us support outreach to the other members of Salem who are non-English speakers, and to other folks across the state. We hope to have this presentation in a format that will make it useful for Spanish speakers, and that's our goal in the next month or so. So thank you all very much. We really appreciate your being here.